The restaurant was the kind of place where the silverware felt heavy, and the conversations were light all surface we were celebrating, or at least he was another victory for his firm. I was there as part of the scenery, the supportive wife. I'd worn a simple black dress, something elegant. I thought my hair was neat. I felt comfortable, I felt like myself. He was talking shop with a colleague, his voice a low, confident rumble. I was half listening, smiling at the right moments, my hand resting on the stem of my wine glass. Then his colleague's wife leaned in, a woman whose smile was as sharp as her manicure. She said something about the importance of image in their industry, how perception is everything. My husband nodded, his eyes sweeping over the table. And then they landed on me. It wasn't a look of love or partnership, it was an assessment. CEO herself, we sat in her sleek minimalist office, and she didn't ask me about my gaps in employment. She asked me about consumer trust. She asked me about what makes a brand feel human in a digital age. I spoke from the heart. I talked about substance over style, about the quiet power of genuine connection. She listened, really listened. A week later, the offer came. It wasn't for a back-office role. It was for the lead of their new brand identity campaign. They weren't just hiring me for my skills. It was Sarah who finally broke through. She called me for the third time that week, and I sent it to voicemail again. A minute later, my phone buzzed with a text. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. I am outside, I am not leaving until you open the door. I peeked through the blinds. And there, she was standing on my porch, arms crossed with two large coffees in a carrier. She looked determined. I opened the door and she walked right and handed me a coffee and said, "Talk now, and don't give me that I am fine nonsense. You've been a ghost for weeks." We sat on the couch, and it all just spilled out, the plain comment, the dismissal, the crushing feeling of being invisible in my own life. I cried, which I hated. But I couldn't stop. I expected her to maybe offer some polite reassurance, to tell me I was being silly. But she didn't. She got angry, not at me. But for me, her face just hardened. He said, "What? That's not an observation, that's an insult. And you are the furthest thing from plain I have ever known." Then she started listing things, specific things. "Remember when you organized the entire charity auction for the school and raised twice what they expected? That wasn't plain, that was a force of nature. Remember how you sat with me for 3 days straight when my dad died, and you just knew when to talk and when to be silent? That's not plain, that's profound. Your laugh, the way it fills up a whole room, that is not a plain laugh." It was like she was handing me back pieces of myself that I had forgotten existed. She called Chloe and Maya, and within an hour they were all there, crowded onto my couch. And they did the same thing. They became a mirror, but not the kind my husband had held up. Their mirror reflected back the woman I actually was, vibrant, capable, kind, fierce. They reminded me of stories I hadn't thought about in years, of times I had been brave or funny or strong. Their perspective was a lifeline. They weren't just offering sympathy, they were offering me the truth. And the truth was, I had been living in a funhouse mirror for so long I'd started to believe the distorted image was real. Their support wasn't passive, it was a rally, it was unwavering. They made it clear I wasn't in this alone. Chloe said, "Okay, enough crying, what's the plan, what do you need?" And that's when the collaboration really began. It was Maya who connected the dots. She works in marketing and had heard through the grapevine about the major campaign my husband's biggest rival was launching. They were looking for a new face, someone authentic, someone with everyday elegance. She looked right at me and said, "It's you, this is perfect, it's literally you." I immediately balked. "Me a model? That's ridiculous. I am not that person." But they wouldn't hear it. Sarah said, "Stop, just stop. This isn't about being a model. This is about you reclaiming your space. This is about showing everyone, especially yourself, who you are." So they became my catalysts. Maya got me the contact information for the creative director, Sarah, and Chloe became my personal preparation committee. The days leading up to the interview were a whirlwind of their making. They came over with outfits and laid them all out on my bed. We had a fashion show, just the four of us, with terrible pop music playing way too loud. They were brutally honest and hilariously encouraging. "No, that color washes you out. Yes, that cut is incredible on you." That's the one. They practiced interview questions with me, pretending to be stern executives. "So Ms. Jones, why do you think you're right for this role?" And when I'd fumble, "We're hiring me to be the face of it." The irony was so profound, I could barely breathe. I signed the contract without telling a soul. They'd stop me and say, "No, say it like you believe it, because we believe it." This transformation was a group project. Every small win was a shared victory. When I got the call back, we celebrated with cheap champagne and pizza. When the final confirmation email came through, they screamed louder than I did. They were invested. This wasn't just my new job, it was our collective triumph over that awful isolating feeling of being plain. The day of the big photo shoot, they were there, they drove me, they held my bag. They gave me a pep talk in the car that was equal parts motivational speech and stand-up comedy. I walked onto that set nervous, but I could feel them there, my foundation, my safety net. And when the stylist finished, when the clothes were on, and the lights were hot, I didn't feel like an imposter. I felt like myself amplified. I felt the version of me they had always seen. The reveal when the campaign finally launched was everything, but the moment wasn't. When I saw my face on the billboard, it was later that evening my husband saw it. Of course, his reaction was a confused mix of shock and something that might have been pride. But it felt distant, like it was coming from the other side of a glass wall. It was secondary, it didn't matter. The real moment was when I walked into the restaurant, where my friends were waiting. They had reserved a table. And when I walked in, they didn't just cheer, they stood up and applauded. It was loud and messy and full of genuine, uncomplicated joy. Sarah hugged me so tight, I could barely breathe, and whispered, "I told you." So we toasted with expensive champagne this time. And we laughed until our sides hurt. They talked about the photos, about how stunning I looked, but more than that, they talked about the light in my eyes. They saw me. They had always seen me. Sitting there surrounded by their noise and their love, I understood something fundamental. Real strength doesn't come from weathering the storm alone. That's not strength, that's just solitude. Real strength comes from having a community that sees the storm brewing and builds you a shelter before the first drop of rain falls. The right people in your life, your true support system. They will never see you as plain, they are the custodians of your light. They see it even when it's flickering, and they will do anything to help it shine. They are the mirror that never lies, the chorus that sings you back to yourself when you've forgotten the words. My journey wasn't a solo mission, it was a pilgrimage with my favorite people, and we arrived together. The hum of the party was a familiar sound in our home, laughter, the clink of glasses, the low murmur of a dozen conversations weaving together. I moved through the rooms, refilling a bowl of snacks, straightening a picture frame, playing the part of the hostess. It was a role I knew well. I caught a glimpse of my husband Mark across the living room. He was in his element, holding court with a group from his firm, his smile wide and confident. I felt a familiar warmth, a pride in him, in us, in this life we'd built. I slipped into the kitchen to grab another bottle of wine. The noise from the party was a little muffled here, separated by the large archway. I could still see everyone, but the sound was softer. That's when I heard his voice, clear and close. He must have been standing just on the other side of the arch, in the dining room, partially hidden by the wall. He was talking to Stephen, his new business partner. I was about to call out to let him know I was getting more wine when his words stopped me. Omnia launch event was the talk of the industry. It was held in a repurposed warehouse, all exposed brick and soaring ceilings, a deliberate contrast to the stuffy hotel ballrooms my husband's company favored. I arrived early, a bundle of nerves tucked inside a custom-made gown of deep emerald green. It was anything but plain. My team hovered around me, all excitement and encouragement. Then the guests started flowing, and I stood off to the side watching. And then I saw him, my husband. He came with a group. "Oh, she's fantastic," Mark was saying, and I knew he was talking about me. I smiled to myself, preparing to step forward. "She runs the house flawlessly, never a complaint, a great wife." Really? There was a pause, and I heard the clink of his glass against the table. "But let's be honest, Stephen, for this kind of networking, she's a bit too plain. She doesn't have that edge, you know what I mean. It's fine for company barbecues, but for schmoozing clients, I usually go." The words didn't hit me all at once. It was like a slow leak of ice water into my veins. Plain, the word was so small, so dismissive. It wasn't spoken in anger, it was worse. It was casual, a simple, accepted fact he was sharing with a colleague. This wasn't a heated argument. This was his truth, the genuine private opinion he held of me, the performance I was giving as a hostess, the smile on my face. It all froze. The noise of the party seemed to fade into a dull roar, a distant ocean. I was suddenly separate from. I stood there, holding the cold bottle of wine, my knuckles white. I took a deep breath, then another. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the oven door. I saw a woman in a safe, simple black dress, a woman who organized parties, but didn't have the edge to attend them as a real partner. I saw plain. And in that moment, a switch flipped. The hurt was immense, a sharp, aching wound. But on top of it settled a strange, cold calm. The world hadn't ended, the party was still going. I had to go back out there, So I walked back into the living room, my smile perfectly in place. I poured wine, I laughed at a joke, I touched Mark's arm. As I passed he smiled at me, a warm, oblivious smile. And the chasm between his public affection and his private assessment felt like a mile deep. I performed my role perfectly that night, but inside the blueprint for a different life was already being drawn. The next morning, everything looked the same. The sun came through the windows. The leftover party plates were in the sink. Mark kissed me goodbye before heading to the office. But I was different. The hurt had crystallized into something else, a quiet, steely determination. I wasn't going to scream or cry or confront him. What would that achieve? He'd apologize, call it a mistake. Say, he was just showing off for Stephen. He might even believe that, but I would always know the truth. I had heard the unguarded version of him, so I decided on a different path, a silent one. I started that very afternoon. While he was at work, I was at my laptop. I found online courses for digital marketing, a field I'd always been curious about, but never had the confidence to pursue. I enrolled, using my own savings. I started reading industry blogs, following leaders on professional networks. It was slow at first, frustrating. My brain felt rusty from years of focusing solely on domestic life. But I kept going. The word plane would echo in my head, and I'd push through another module. Month later, I joined a gym, not a casual yoga class, but a serious strength training gym. I hired a trainer for a few sessions to learn the ropes. I started eating differently, not for weight loss, but for fuel. I wanted to feel strong in my body, not just look a certain way. Mark noticed the changes. Of course, you look great, honey, he'd say, squeezing my waist. Whatever you're doing, keep it up. He thought it was for him, a renewed effort to be a better wife. He had no idea it was the foundation of my escape. I started building a network, but my own. I joined online forums and local meetup groups related to my courses. I started conversations. I asked questions. I began to craft a professional profile separate from my identity. As Mark's wife, I met people for coffee. I listened to their career stories. I was gathering pieces of a new world, brick by brick, in secret. It was my project, my secret life. Mark would come home and ask about my day, and I'd talk about cleaning out the garage or meeting a friend. Of colleagues, probably to scout the competition, to dismiss it. He looked confident, laughing at something, his eyes scanning the room with a proprietary air. For lunch, it wasn't a lie, not exactly. It was just a massive omission. The gulf between us widened. But he was blissfully unaware, floating on the surface, while I was building a new continent deep below. A year passed. The quiet work had become my routine. I had a portfolio of projects I'd completed for my courses, a list of contacts, and a confidence I hadn't felt since I was young. The initial sting of pain had faded, replaced by the solid satisfaction of competence. I was no longer the woman he described. I knew it, and soon others would too. The email came on a Tuesday morning. It was from a woman named Sarah, a contact I'd met at a networking event a few months prior. She was the head of marketing for a rising lifestyle brand. A direct competitor to the company. Mark was trying to win a major contract with her. Subject line was simple: opportunity. She said she'd been impressed with my ideas and my quiet determination. She asked if I would be interested in coming on board to lead their new digital campaign. The salary she mentioned was substantial. The title was Director of Digital Outreach. I read the email 3 times. My heart wasn't pounding with excitement or anxiety. It was a steady, sure beat. This wasn't a surprise. It was the logical next step. I had built the path, and here was the door at the end of it. The choice was clear. It wasn't about revenge. It was about alignment. The person I had become was not the person Mark saw me as. Accepting this offer was simply about living the truth of who I now was. I drafted my reply, accepted a meeting, and went through the interview process with a calm I hadn't known I possessed. When the formal contract arrived, I printed it. I held the pages in my hands, the weight of them feeling significant. I signed my name with a steady hand. It was the quietest, most powerful thing I had ever done. I placed the signed copy in my bag, to be mailed separately from the house. Mark didn't know a thing. The campaign launch was set for a major industry event. I knew Mark would be there with his team, hoping to impress his clients. I arrived early, wearing a suit I'd bought for myself, a sharp, modern cut that felt nothing like plain. I stood near the back. As the room filled up, I saw him come in with his colleagues, his posture confident. He hadn't seen me yet. The lights dimmed, and the presentation began. The screen lit up with the campaign I had helped create, my ideas, my strategy, my name listed in the credits as the director. I watched his back. I saw the moment he recognized the brand, his competitor. I saw his head tilt as he read my name on the screen. His posture stiffened, he slowly turned his eyes. Scanning the darkened room, they found me. The look on his face was a complex mix of confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror. The presentation ended to applause, people began to mingle. He made his way over to me, weaving through the crowd, his face was pale. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low, strained. "What are you doing here? Is this some kind of joke?" "It's not a joke, Mark," I said, my voice calm. "It's my new job. I am leading their digital campaign." The lights dimmed, a hush fell over the crowd. The CEO took the stage and gave a powerful speech about a new era for Omnia, about authenticity and substance. Then she said the words, "And now I'd like to introduce you to the person who embodies this new direction, the new face of Omnia." The giant screens behind her flickered to life, and there I was, a stunning, larger-than-life portrait of my face, my eyes looking directly out at the audience. A wave of applause started, but I was watching only one person. "But why wouldn't you tell me? How could you do this to me? This is my biggest client." He was trying to keep his voice down, but the anger and panic were bubbling up. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I felt nothing but a distant pity. "Do you remember the party we threw last year, the one with your colleagues from the firm?" He blinked, confused by the shift. "What does that have to do with anything?" "I was in the kitchen," I said, my tone even factual. "You were talking to Stephen by the archway. You told him I was a great wife, but that I was too plain for the kind of networking he needed, that I didn't have the edge." The color drained completely from his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He remembered. "This isn't about doing something to you, Mark," I continued. "It's about what I heard that night." Those words had consequences. They showed me a version of myself I didn't want to be, so I changed this. I gestured around the room at the campaign visuals. "This is the consequence, not of my anger, but of your honesty." He stared at me, truly seeing me for the first time in years. The woman before him was not plain. She was formidable. She had built a career from nothing in secret. While he remained oblivious, the betrayal he felt was nothing compared to the one he had committed. "I built a life, Mark," I said softly, "a life that doesn't require your validation. I don't need you to tell me I have an edge anymore. I know that I do." I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there in the middle of the bustling event. The space between us was finally and irrevocably filled with the truth, and I was finally at home in it. For years my world was a study in beige, not by my choice, but by a slow, quiet erosion. My husband Mark was a good man, a practical man. He built things you could see, touch, and put a price on buildings, portfolios, a life that looked flawless from the outside. And my art, my paints and canvases, the clutter of my creative spirit, became a problem to be managed, an indulgence. He'd say things like, "It's a lovely hobby, darling, but let's keep the mess in the studio." And the studio became smaller and smaller until it was just a corner of the guest room, and then finally a box in the closet. My passion was tucked away, deemed impractical, unimportant, a frivolous thing that didn't fit the clean, minimalist aesthetic of our successful life. The color drained from his face. His smile froze, then vanished completely. His colleagues were nudging him, their expressions a mix of confusion and dawning amusement. He looked from the screen to where I was standing, and our eyes met across the crowded room. The shock in his was absolute. It was a perfect, silent moment of demolition. I gave him a small, calm smile, and then I turned and walked to the stage. The applause was deafening. My heart wasn't pounding with fear, it was thrumming with power. I delivered my speech. The night he called me plain, it was at a dinner party. His boss was there, and his boss wife, a woman who wore her ambition like expensive perfume. I was playing my part, the supportive wife, pouring wine, laughing at the right moments, serving a meal that was perfect and elegant. I felt like a stage manager in my own home, ensuring every prop was in place, every line delivered smoothly. And I suppose I looked the part too. I wore a simple, tasteful dress, my hair was neat. I was the picture of understated elegance, but inside I was screaming. I felt like a ghost, a pale imitation of the woman I used to be, the one who used to smear cobalt blue and cadmium red across a canvas with her bare hands. He was telling a story, some anecdote about a difficult client, and he gestured toward me and my wife. "Here," he said, with a fond, patronizing smile, "she's my rock, so steady, so plain." He said it like it was the highest compliment, like he was praising a reliable loaf of bread. The table chuckled politely, but the word hit me with the force of a physical blow. It didn't just land on the surface, it sank deep right into the core of that neglected boxed-up part of me plane. It was the final dismissal. It wasn't just that I was boring, it was that the vibrant, messy, colorful soul I knew was inside had been deemed invisible, irrelevant. The pain was so sharp, so precise. It was almost clarifying in that moment, surrounded by the clinking of crystal and the murmur of polite conversation. I made a silent, furious vow. The next morning after he left for work, I didn't clean up the breakfast dishes. I didn't make the bed. I went straight to the closet. And I pulled out that box. I dragged it into the center of the living room, the room with the white carpet and the beige sofa. And I opened it. The smell of turpentine and old linseed oil rose up, a scent that was more familiar to me than my own perfume. I unrolled a blank canvas, the stark white surface, staring back at me. I didn't think I just started. I squeezed paint directly onto the wood, rich, violent shades of alizarin crimson and phthalo blue. I didn't use brushes. I used my hands, my fingers, old rags. I was channeling everything: humiliation, the anger, the years of quiet compliance, the feeling of being neatly packaged and stored away. It was messy, it was chaotic, it was the absolute opposite of plain. That first piece was a storm. It was all swirling dark colors and jagged scraped-back lines, with a single stark slash of gold leaf cutting through the center. It was ugly, and it was beautiful, and it was the most honest thing I had created in a decade. And it was just the beginning. I started waking up at dawn before the sun, and I would paint until my arms ached. The guest room became my studio again. But this time, I didn't contain the mess. Paint splatters trailed down the hallway, canvases leaned walls. My home, Mark's pristine, perfect home, became a testament to my unmaking and my remaking. He was horrified, of course. He'd come home and sigh about the mess, ask when I was going to return to normal. But I was done with normal. This chaotic act of creation was my new normal. It was my therapy, my rebellion, my reclamation. The work began to change. It wasn't just about the anger anymore. It became about discovery. I started exploring texture, mixing sand and plaster into the paint, building up layers, and then scraping them back to reveal what was hidden underneath. It was a metaphor I was living in real time. I was scraping back the plain, compliant surface to find the complex, textured woman. Below, the colors became more daring, more expressive. I painted immense abstract portraits of female figures, not as serene beauties, but as powerful elemental forces. They were cracked, they were fragmented, but there was a fierce light burning within them. I was painting my own soul, and it was anything but plain. Voice clear and steady, I spoke about the courage it takes to be genuine. Every word felt like a stone laid on the grave of his comment. On a whim, I started an Instagram account, a pseudonym. I called myself Kintsugi Gold, inspired by the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery, with gold highlighting the cracks instead of hiding them. I posted photos of my work in progress, close-ups of the textures, the layers. I wrote short poetic captions about brokenness and beauty, about the power of reclaiming your own narrative. I didn't expect anything. It was just another part of the process, a digital journal. But people started to respond. Left comments about how the work resonated with them, how it spoke to their own feelings of being stifled or unseen. A small community formed, a following of people who saw the vulnerability and the strength in the art. They saw the story I was telling, even if they didn't know it was mine. Then the email came. It was from a woman named Sarah Jensen, the director of brand innovation for a fashion house called Evam. I'd heard of them. They were a rival to the label Mark's company. Often worked with, they were known for their bold artistic campaigns, for championing female creators. Her message was direct. She said she had been following my work for weeks and was captivated by its raw authenticity. She said it had a haunting, powerful quality that was rare. She asked if I would be interested in meeting to discuss a potential collaboration. My heart was pounding. It felt surreal. The world I had built in secret, the world born from a moment of profound pain, was suddenly knocking on my door. We met at a small gallery cafe. Sarah was sharp, perceptive. She didn't talk about markets or demographics. She talked about art. She said she was curating a new campaign for Evam. But it wasn't just about selling clothes. It was about telling a story of transformation, of resilience. She said my artwork, the journey it represented from fragmentation to wholeness, was the exact aesthetic and narrative she wanted to build the entire campaign around. And then she made the offer. She didn't want to just license my art. She wanted me. She wanted me to be the creative force behind the campaign, to design the sets, to inform the photography with my aesthetic, and she wanted me to be the face of it. She said the story needed an author, a protagonist. She said the authenticity comes from you. The power of this is that it's real. We want you to be the muse and the maker. The irony was so profound, it took my breath away. The plain woman was being hired for her unparalleled authenticity. The pain caused by the dismissal of my creativity was the very thing that had created the art that made me valuable. I wasn't being asked to be a model who wore clothes. I was being asked to be an artist whose life and work gave the clothes their meaning. It was a complete inversion of everything I had known. I said yes, without a moment's hesitation. Photo shoot was unlike anything I had ever imagined. It was held in a raw industrial space that I had chosen. The set was my studio, amplified my canvases, some of them towering unfinished pieces, were the backdrop. The models, a diverse group of strong, interesting women, moved through the space I had created. I had painted directly onto the floors and walls. I had encouraged the photographer to capture the mess, the process, the humanity. There were close-ups of paint-stained hands, of intense, thoughtful gazes. Beautiful, imperfect textures of the art. I was in some of the shots not as a polished mannequin, but as I was an artist at work with my hair tied back, wearing a simple smock over an even dress, my focus entirely on the canvas in front of me. The campaign was titled simply Unseen. The launch was a sensation. The marketing focused on the story behind the art. Interviews came out, where I spoke for the first time publicly about my journey. I never mentioned Mark by name, but I talked about the feeling of being boxed in the moment of being called plain, and the decision to channel that pain into creation. The campaign was celebrated for its artistic integrity, for its genuine message of empowerment. It was successful because it was true. After the formalities, he found me. He pulled me into a quiet corner, his grip tight on my arm. "What is this?" He hissed, his voice a low, frantic whisper. "What are you playing at? You've made me a laughingstock." I gently removed his hand. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. I was no longer the woman in the passenger seat. "I am not playing at anything," I said, my voice even. "This is my career." He started to splutter, apologies and accusations tangled together. "I never meant, you know I love you, but this is." Mark saw it all. He saw the digital billboards in the city, the magazine spreads. He was at a business event, and someone actually complimented him on his wife's incredible work. I saw the confusion on his face, and then the dawning, staggering realization. He had witnessed the celebration of the very creativity he had indirectly stifled. The plain wife was now the muse for a global brand, her art hailed as a powerful commercial and personal asset. There was no confrontation, just a quiet, unbridgeable distance, the understanding that we were living in two entirely different stories. I sit here now in my bright, sprawling studio that is filled with light and color and chaos. The box in the closet is a distant memory. That shell of a woman has been shattered, and what emerged was not a monster, but my true self. The pain of that word plain was the catalyst. It was the match that lit the fire, and I've learned that creativity is not a hobby. It's not a frivolous pastime. It is the very core of who we are. It is a force that can transform pain into power, that can turn a whisper of an idea into a statement that echoes across the world. My exterior was never plain. It was just a canvas waiting for the courage to be filled with color. The cracks didn't start with the word plain. That was just the final piece of mortar falling out of the wall, the one that made the whole structure impossible to ignore. It had been crumbling for years, a slow, quiet decay. I had become an expert in the architecture of our marriage, learning exactly which beams to avoid, leaning on which floors would creak under the slightest pressure. My life was a performance. Every morning I'd put on the costume of the perfect wife. I'd choose my clothes based on what he'd approved of. In the past, I'd plan my days around his schedule, his preferences. I learned to fold my own opinions away like out-of-season clothes, because they never seemed to fit the narrative he wanted. Our home was a beautiful set, and I was the lead actress in a play where my only line was "Yes, dear." The applause was his casual indifference. The silence was my growing emptiness. The comment itself was so casual. We were getting ready for some charity gala. He wanted to impress his clients that I was wearing a simple black dress. I thought it was elegant. He looked me over, not with malice, but with the detached assessment you'd give a piece of furniture. He adjusted his tie in the mirror and said, "It's fine, a bit plain, but it's fine. Y'all blend in." And he meant it as a statement of fact, not an insult. That was the worst part to him. Blending in was the highest compliment I could achieve. Being unnoticeable was my purpose. That night at the gala, I looked around the room. I saw the other wives, their polished smiles, their practiced laughter. And I saw myself in them, a collection of pleasant well-dressed echoes. I felt a fracture open up inside me. It wasn't anger, not yet, it was a profound, chilling clarity. This wasn't a life, it was a long-term role I'd been cast in, and I had forgotten I could leave the stage. The decision to leave was a quiet one. There was no dramatic confrontation. I didn't pack my bags after he said the word. It took weeks. It was the decision to stop performing one Tuesday. I called a realtor. I found a small apartment downtown with big windows. And no history when I told him I was leaving. His reaction was confusion, genuine, baffled confusion. Why, he asked, is there someone else? The idea that I might leave for myself was so foreign to him. It didn't even compute, I simply said. Treachery, how could you do this to me? His apologies sounded hollow, pathetic excuses from a man who was only sorry he got caught, sorry his assessment was so publicly proven wrong. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw the cowardice behind his bluster. He was afraid of the professional threat, yes, but more than that, afraid of the person I had become without his permission. I need to find out who I am when I am not your wife. And I left the business idea, the brand ambassador thing, that came later. The leaving was purely for me. The first few months in the apartment were strange. The silence was different. It wasn't the silence of neglect, it was the silence of possibility. I started doing things for no reason other than that I wanted to. I bought a bright yellow armchair that he would have hated. I ate dinner at 10 p.m. if I felt like it. I started sketching again, something I'd loved in college, but had abandoned. Because it wasn't a serious pursuit, I was rebuilding myself brick by brick. And for the first time, I was the architect. The professional opportunity felt like it came from that new sense of self. An old friend from design school had heard I'd left my marriage. She called me for coffee. She was working for a relatively new rising fashion brand, Ethos, that was all about authenticity and individual expression. They were looking for a new face, not a 20-year-old model, but a woman, someone with a story. My friend said, your story is about reinvention. It's powerful. I was terrified, but the part of me that was tired of blending in said yes. The first photo shoot was surreal. The stylist brought out clothes that were all texture and color, and bold lines, clothes that demanded to be seen. The makeup artist didn't cover up the faint lines around my eyes. She said they gave my face character. The photographer, a man named David, was directing me, but his direction was nothing like I was used to. He wasn't saying smile for the camera, he was saying think about the moment. You decided you were enough, just let me see that in your eyes. And for the first time, being looked at didn't feel like being judged, it felt like being seen. David and I developed an easy rhythm. He was the creative director for the entire campaign, so we spent a lot of time together. We'd have meetings about the concept, the locations, the mood. Our conversations started stretching beyond work. We'd talk about art, about books, about the stupid things we did in our 20s. He was curious. He'd ask me questions, and then actually listen to the answers. He remembered small things I'd mentioned weeks before. It was a novel experience to have my thoughts treated as something valuable. Our friendship was built on a foundation of mutual respect. He admired the courage it took to start over. I admired his vision, his passion for his work. We were just two people who enjoyed each other's company. There was no pressure, no performance. I found myself laughing with him, a real unforced laugh that came from my stomach. I didn't have to monitor the sound of it to make sure it was pleasing. The contrast between what I had and what I was building was staggering. With my husband, love was a transaction. I provided a stable, pleasant home life. And in return, I received financial security. And the status of being married. Affection was scheduled like a business meeting. With David, everything was different. It was in the small things. He'd bring me a coffee exactly how I liked it without me asking. If I had an idea during a shoot, his face would light up, and he'd say, that's brilliant, let's try it. The industry press the next week was a validation. I could never have imagined. The campaign was praised as a masterstroke. Articles talked about my compelling authenticity and how Omnia's choice signaled a brilliant human-centric shift. In the market, my profile, the one my husband called too plain, was now being analyzed as the new gold standard. I was invited to speak on panels. My opinion was sought after in the very arena. He told me I didn't belong. I was not just accepted, I was celebrated. He celebrated my intelligence. He made me feel like a partner. There was one evening after a long day on set. We were the last ones there packing up equipment. The sun was setting, casting a golden light through the studio windows. We were both tired, just sitting on the floor leaning against a backdrop. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what you're doing, it's remarkable." I laughed it off, saying it was just a job. But he shook his head. "No. It's not. I've worked with a lot of people. Most of them are playing a part. But you're just so entirely yourself after everything you've been through, to have that strength, that clarity, it's remarkable." He called me remarkable, not pretty, not nice, not plain, remarkable. The word hung in the air between us, warm and solid in that moment. I felt the last vestiges of the old me, the woman who believed she was meant to blend, in simply dissolve. This was a love that empowered. It didn't seek to dim my light to make itself brighter. It wanted to illuminate me, so I could shine on my own. The launch of the campaign was a huge event. Ethos had gone all out. My face was on billboards, in magazines, on the sides of buses. Ethos, find your authentic self. The irony was so perfect it was almost poetic. And I wasn't just the face. I was happy, genuinely, deeply happy. I was doing work I loved. And I was with a man who saw the real me, and loved what he saw. The launch party was held at a gallery. It was packed with press, influencers, industry people. I was in the middle of it, wearing a stunning Ethos gown, holding David's hand. I felt confident. I felt like I belonged. And then I saw him, my exuberant. He was standing near the entrance, looking lost. He must have been invited as part of the industry crowd. He was staring at a huge digital screen that was playing the campaign video. It was a close-up of my face, laughing, my eyes full of life. I watched him watch me. I saw the confusion on his face, then the dawning realization. He wasn't just seeing my professional success. He was seeing my joy. He was seeing the way David stood beside me, his hand resting gently on the small of my back, looking at me with open admiration. He was seeing the life he thought was too bold, too much, being celebrated by everyone in the room. He was seeing that I was anything but plain. He caught my eye from across the room. There was no anger in his gaze, just a kind of stunned defeat. He had come, I think, expecting to see a woman pretending to be happy, a facade built on revenge. But what he saw was undeniably real. I gave him a small, polite nod. And then I turned back to David, who was laughing at something a journalist had said. I leaned into him, and he squeezed my hand. The moment with my ex was over in a second. But it was final. It was the closing of a door I had already walked through. Later that night, after the party had died down, David and I were walking home. The city was quiet. He stopped under a street lamp and looked at me. "You were incredible tonight," he said. "You own that room." I smiled. "It feels different," I said. "This life, it feels like it actually fits." He brushed a strand of hair from my face. "That's because it's yours," he said. "You built it, every single part of it." Later in the car, the silence was different. He had that post-event energy, buzzing with the connections he'd made. I was quiet, thinking, he must have noticed. He placed his hand on my knee, a patronizing gesture. "You were quiet tonight," he said. I just shrugged, said I was tired. He sighed, a sound of mild disappointment. "It's just," he started. And I knew that tone. It was his constructive criticism tone. "At these functions, you have to understand, image is paramount. It's about making an impression." He glanced. The fallout was messy, of course. The divorce proceedings were tense. His lawyers tried to frame my success as a malicious act. But it was hard to argue with a legally binding contract. I moved into a bright apartment with a view of the city, a place that was entirely mine. I don't think about him much anymore. Sometimes a memory of that car ride will surface. But the sting is gone. It's been replaced by a profound sense of peace. And he was right. I had built it. I had left behind the gilded cage of a marriage that demanded I make myself small. I had stepped into the uncertainty of being alone. I had embraced a chance to redefine myself professionally. And in doing all of that, I had created a space where a real healthy love could actually grow, a love that wasn't about completing someone, but about complementing them. The ultimate message wasn't about revenge or showing him up. It was about the simple, profound truth that when you finally stop accepting a life that diminishes you, you make room for a life that fulfills you in every way imaginable. The career, the confidence, the love, it was all part of the same beautiful, authentic whole. I learned that self-worth isn't something someone can give you, and it's certainly not something they can take away with a careless word. It's something you build yourself brick by brick, with every skill you master, every boundary you set, every silent decision you make in the dark. His comment was meant to diminish me, to keep me in a box he found comfortable. But he was wrong. It wasn't an insult. It was a diagnosis. He diagnosed me as plain because he couldn't handle the complexity, the ambition, the power that was always there just beneath the surface. He needed me to be simple. And in the end, my revenge wasn't just about becoming the face of his rival. It was about proving to myself, most of all, that I was never plain to begin with. I was just dormant, and waking up was the most powerful thing I have ever done. The word hung in the air between us, simple and final, plain. That's what he said. We were getting ready for a dinner party, his work colleagues. I was trying on a dress, asking for his opinion, which was a mistake I wouldn't make again. He looked up from his phone, his eyes scanning me with a kind of detached assessment. He wasn't even being cruel. That was the worst part. It was a statement of fact in his mind. It's fine, it's just a bit plain on you. And he went back to his screen. Plain, it's such a small word, isn't it? 5 letters. But it has a weight to it, a density that crushes everything underneath. It wasn't just about the dress. I knew that instantly. It was a key that unlocked a door I had been keeping closed for years. It was a dismissal of my entire being in that moment. I felt myself shrink. The colors in the room seemed to dim. My reflection in the mirror became indistinct, like a faded photograph, plain, uninteresting, unremarkable, unworthy of a second glance. He had given a name to the quiet anxiety that had been my companion for most of our marriage, and in doing so, he made it real. I went to the dinner party. I smiled, I made polite conversation, but the whole time I felt like a ghost. I could see people's eyes sliding past me as if I were a piece of furniture. And I thought, he's right, I am plain. I have made myself plain to fit into his world, to not cause a stir, to be the supportive, unobtrusive wife. And the truly terrifying part was how effective it had been. I had perfected the art of being background noise. That single comment started a process of deconstruction in my mind. I began to pick apart our entire relationship, looking for other instances, other tiny paper cuts that had slowly bled me dry. The way he'd subtly steer conversations away from topics I was passionate about, the faint, patient sigh when I'd tell a story he deemed too long, the way he'd rephrase my opinions in a more rational way. When we were with friends, it was never overtly malicious. It was a pattern of subtle erosion, a quiet campaign to sand down my edges until I was smooth, seamless, uncomplicated, plain. His comment was just the final nail in a coffin I had been helping to build. The initial feeling was paralysis. It was a profound sense of erasure, to be so thoroughly dismissed by the person whose opinion you've been taught to value above your own. It creates a specific kind of silence. It's not an empty silence. It's a silence full of the echoes of everything you've ever held back. I felt invisible, not just to him, but to myself. Who was I underneath all this accommodation? I genuinely didn't know. Over at me, that dress was fine, but darling, you have to understand, sometimes you can come across as just a bit too plain for this world. It doesn't project the success I am trying to convey. The shift didn't happen overnight. It started with a question, a tiny crack in the foundation. Why does his approval matter so much? I had built my self-worth on the shaky ground of his perception. I was living in a house of mirrors, and every reflection was distorted by his gaze. I started reading. At first it was articles online about self-esteem, about toxic relationships. Then it was books. I didn't go to therapy, not formally, but those books became my therapists. I learned about internal validation versus external validation. I learned that constructive criticism builds you up, while destructive negation tears you down. His comment wasn't feedback, it was a negation of my essence. I started to experiment quietly. I signed up for a pottery class, something I'd wanted to do for years, but he'd always dismissed as messy and pointless. My hands, covered in clay, felt alive for the first time in a long time. I started reading novels again, the big, sprawling kind. He rolled his eyes at I reconnected with a friend from college, the one he'd always found a bit too loud and dramatic. With her I could laugh without filtering the sound. These were small acts of rebellion, but each one felt like reclaiming a piece of stolen land. And a strange thing began to happen. The word plain started to lose its power. It began to transform in my mind. Instead of meaning boring or empty, it started to feel like a blank slate, a clean, open space, a canvas I had spent so long layering on the expectations of a wife, the persona of a supportive partner, that I had lost the original painting underneath. Now I was scraping all that away. What was left wasn't nothing, it was potential. It was me, raw and unedited. And that was terrifying. But it was also exciting. The opportunity with the rival brand didn't feel like a conscious decision at first. It felt like an accident, a cosmic joke. A friend from my pottery class knew someone who worked in marketing there. They were launching a new campaign focused on authentic women, real stories, real faces. My friend mentioned me casually as someone with an interesting energy. They reached out. When I got the email, I almost deleted it, me a brand ambassador. It was laughable, the plain wife. But then I thought about that blank canvas, I thought about the word authentic. It was the antithesis of everything I had been living. I went to the meeting more out of curiosity than anything else. I expected to feel like an imposter. But the people in the room, they were listening. They asked me questions about my life, about what I cared about the journey I was on. They weren't looking at me as an extension of my husband. They saw me, and they valued what they saw when they offered me the contract. It wasn't just a job, it was an affirmation. It was a statement from the outside world that directly contradicted the one I had lived with. For so long, to become a face was the most powerful rebuttal to being called plain and invisible. It was taking the insult and wearing it as a badge of honor. The word hung in the airplane. It wasn't shouted, it was delivered like a fact, a simple piece of feedback. But it shattered something in me. It wasn't just the word itself. It was the context, it was the casual way. He reduced my entire presence to a liability for his brand. I wasn't his wife anymore in that moment. I was an accessory that didn't quite match the suit. I looked out the window at the blurring city lights, the illusion of our partnership, the one where I was the steady, supportive foundation for his. Watching my husband's reaction was a study in detachment. When I told him, his face went through a series of micro-expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then a slow-dawning irritation. He tried to frame it as a business decision. Are you sure about their market share? The logistics will be a nightmare. He couldn't attack the idea itself, so he attacked the practicalities. But I wasn't seeking his approval anymore. I was observing him from a new distance, with a kind of clinical curiosity. I saw his insecurity, his need for control laid bare. His comment about me being plain was never really about me. It was about him. It was about his need to feel superior, to have a wife who didn't outshine him, who existed to bolster his own image. My newfound visibility was a threat to that carefully constructed order. The photo shoot for the campaign was a pivotal moment. Standing in front of those lights, with a team of people whose job was to highlight my features, not hide them, was surreal. They weren't trying to make me look like someone else, the stylist said. We just want to accentuate what's already there. And for the first time, I believed that there was something there to accentuate. When the first images came back, I didn't see a plain woman. I saw a woman with depth in her eyes, with lines on her face that spoke of laughter and worry, with a quiet strength in her posture. I saw someone complex. I saw myself. The campaign launched. My face was on buses, in magazines. People I hadn't spoken to in years sent me messages. It was overwhelming, but in a way that felt solid, real. And I realized something crucial: the brand ambassador role wasn't the source of my new confidence. It was an expression of it. It was the outward manifestation of an internal shift that had already occurred. The growth happened in the quiet moments, in the pottery studio, in the pages of a book, in the hard conversations I started to have with myself. The public recognition was just a symptom of the cure. I understand now that my husband's hurtful comment was a gift. It was a painful, brutal gift, but a necessary one. It was the catalyst that forced me to look inward, to question the narrative I had accepted. His projection of plainness onto me was a reflection of his own fears and limitations. I used that negative projection as fuel. I took the word he meant as an insult, and I transformed it. I turned it into a starting point. My relationship with myself is entirely new. I am confident not because I am on a billboard, but because I know who I am, separate from anyone else's opinion. I am complex, with contradictions and passions, and a history that is uniquely mine. I am decidedly not plain. The lesson is that sometimes the most hurtful things said to us can become the very engine of our transformation. They can show us the parts of ourselves we have neglected, the cages we have built around our own spirits. And if we are brave enough to listen not to the insult, but to the truth behind our reaction to it, we can break free. We can paint our own portrait on our own terms, with every color we choose to reclaim. The plain prison, a life in neutrals. Ambitions just cracked open. I didn't say a word, but in that silence a decision was made. A cold, quiet resolve settled in my chest. If I was so plain, so unremarkable, then I had nothing left to lose by becoming remarkable entirely on my own. My closet used to be a sea of beige, a symphony of oatmeal taupe and soft grays. Every garment was chosen for its ability to disappear. I wasn't dressing a person, I was outfitting a ghost. The sweaters were cashmere, yes, but the color of dust. The trousers were perfectly tailored, but in a shade that whispered fade into the background, it was a uniform for a life of quiet compliance. His influence wasn't a loud demanding thing, it was more like a gentle constant pressure, a hand on my arm. In a store steering me past a rack of emerald green, a comment murmured over dinner. That red is a bit much, don't you think? It's not very you. And slowly, over years, me became, whatever he decided it should be, safe, unobtrusive, elegant. In the most boring way imaginable, my reflection became a portrait of his taste, a collection of his preferences. I was a mannequin in the window of the life he had designed. The final straw was so small, we were getting ready for one of his company events. I put on a simple black dress. It was the safest choice in the world. He looked me up and down, gave that little sigh I'd come to know so well, and said, "It's fine, darling, it's just a bit plain." That word hit me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just about the dress. It was the entire summation of my existence in his eyes. I was plain, my clothes were plain, my life was a plain beige rectangle. I looked the mirror and I didn't see a wife, a woman, I saw a placeholder, a well-dressed mannequin, for a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. The style revolution, experimentation, and discovery. The next morning I walked into a salon I'd never been to before. I didn't have an appointment. I just pointed to a picture on the wall of a woman with a sharp, angular bob hair. "The color of polished silver I want." That I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. It had conviction. The snip of the scissors was the most liberating sound I'd ever heard. Each lock of my sensible shoulder-length brown hair that fell to the floor felt like a chain breaking. When I looked in the mirror afterward, I saw stranger, but a stranger with fire in her eyes. Then came the clothes. I avoided the department stores we always shopped at. I found small boutiques with windows full of color. I touched fabrics I'd never have considered before, a stiff taffeta, slippery silk in patterns that looked like shattered glass, thick wool in a crimson so deep it felt like a secret. I tried on a dress with architectural shoulders that made me look powerful. I slipped into a pair of trousers that were actually bright fuchsia. I didn't look in the mirror and ask, "Is this appropriate?" I asked, "Do I feel like myself?" The next morning the sting was still there, but it had transformed into a fuel. I didn't cry. I got up before him and went for a long walk. I thought about my life before him. I had a career once, ambitions that got politely shelved because his were more demanding, more immediately lucrative. I was the one who made the home, who managed the social calendar, who provided the stable base so he could soar, and my reward was to be called plain. It was a brutal clarity. I met a woman named Chloe at a gallery opening. She was a stylist, and she saw me looking lost but determined amidst the art. She took me under her wing. She introduced me to vintage shops, to young designers who played with shape and form. She taught me that fashion wasn't about following rules. It was about breaking them to build something that was uniquely yours. Dressing became a daily act of rebellion and rediscovery. The joy wasn't in the compliments, though they came. The joy was in the simple act of fastening a button and knowing deep in my soul that this was a choice I had made for myself alone. This bold emerald jacket, this sharp-cut blazer, they weren't just clothes, they were armor. They were the physical manifestation of a confidence I was only just beginning to feel. The scouting and the campaign. It happened on a Tuesday. I was waiting in line for coffee, wearing an oversized canary yellow coat and a simple black dress underneath. I felt good. I was reading a book, not checking my phone, just existing in my own colorful bubble. A woman tapped me on the shoulder. She had kind eyes and a camera bag slung over her shoulder. She handed me a card. She was a scout for a fashion brand called Axiom. She said my look, the contrast of the bold color with a quiet intensity, was exactly what they were searching for. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. Axiom's entire ethos was unapologetic individuality. Their slogan was literally the opposite of plain. They built an empire on the very concept my husband had spent a decade teaching me to suppress. The photo shoot was held in a raw industrial loft with huge windows. They didn't try to change me. The stylist, who turned out to be Chloe's friend, said my instinct was what they were buying. They gave me clothes that felt like an extension of what I'd already started. Structured silhouettes, rich textures, colors that commanded attention. Standing in front of the camera was terrifying at first. The lights were hot, the crew was quiet. But then the photographer, a woman with a fierce energy, started to guide me. "Give me defiance," shed, "say now, give me serenity now, give me joy." And I did. I reached into parts of myself I hadn't known were there. It wasn't performing, it was unveiling. When I saw the test shots on the monitor, I barely recognized the woman on the screen. She wasn't just wearing beautiful clothes, she owned them, her gaze was direct, her posture was full of a quiet power. The images were stunning, they weren't pictures of a model. They were a portrait of a transformation. They had captured the exact moment a woman stepped out of the shadows and into her own light. The reveal and the aftermaths. The campaign launched on a Monday. A friend texted me a picture of a massive billboard in the city center there. I was 20 feet tall, wearing a cobalt blue suit, my silver hair catching the sun, looking not at the camera, but past it with a faint knowing smile. My face was everywhere, on social media, on the sides of buses, in glossy magazines. The public reception was a wave of positive energy. People commented on the refreshing authenticity of the campaign. They used words like powerful and real. I started small. I enrolled in an advanced digital marketing certification online. I spent my days, while he was at the office, not just managing the house, but studying. I refreshed my knowledge of market analytics, consumer behavior trends, brand storytelling. I started writing again, creating a professional blog under a pseudonym, dissecting recent ad campaigns with a sharp, critical eye. It was my secret world. I joined industry forums, connecting with other professionals, slowly building a network of my. He saw it, of course. He came home that evening, and the silence in the foyer was heavier than any wed ever had. He didn't yell, he just stood there looking at me, then looking through the window, as if he could still see the ghost of that billboard. He saw the new clothes in my closet, the new cut of my hair. But more than that, he saw the new set of my shoulders, the directness in my eyes. The woman he had called plain was now the literal face of a brand that defined everything. He wasn't the confidence I now carried, was an or. He couldn't penetrate a force field he hadn't approved. The message of it all settled deep within me. This wasn't a story about revenge. It was a story about reclamation. The glow-up wasn't just about better clothes or a new haircut. It was about the fundamental truth that real style has nothing to do with trends, and everything to do with self-worth. It's the courage to let the inside show on the outside. Every bold color I wore was a piece of my voice id, taken back. Every interesting silhouette was a reflection of the complex, interesting person I had always been. Underneath the beige, the clothes were just the packaging. The real transformation was the decision to finally value the contents. The truth is, you never saw me as a partner, not in the way that mattered. You saw the dinners I hosted, the social calendar I managed, the pleasant smile I wore at every corporate function. You saw the support system, the silent partner, and you mistook that silence for a lack of understanding. You'd come home brimming with the day's triumphs and troubles, and you'd talk at me. You'd explain market fluctuations and quarterly reports as if you were teaching a beginner. You never once stopped to consider that I was listening, not just to your words, but to the gaps between them. I was listening to the anxieties you tried to hide, the competitive threats you dismissed too easily, the arrogance that was blinding you to the shifting landscape. I was your secret, unpaid consultant for 20 years, and you never even knew you were being advised. That comment you made, the one you thought was so plain, so simple, about my little hobbies, that was the final data point. It wasn't an insult, it was a symptom. It was the undeniable proof that in your eyes, I would always be the arm candy with an opinion on the floral arrangements, but never on the fiscal strategy. You saw my world as a quaint diversion from the real work you were doing. And in that moment, I realized my value to you was fixed, and it would never appreciate. So I decided to take my insights, the very ones you gave me for free all those years, and I decided to invest them elsewhere, not out of spite, initially out of necessity. The market had spoken. My talents were undervalued in my current position. It was time to seek a better offer. My research was meticulous. I didn't just look at your competitors, I analyzed them. I looked at their financials, their public branding, their corporate culture. And I kept coming back to Ethelgard, not because they were the biggest, but because they were the most poised for a revolution. Their products were superior in ways you always scoffed at, calling them boutique. And niche. Their CEO, Alara Vance, had a reputation for fierce intelligence and a disdain for the old boy network you so comfortably inhabit. Had the engine, but they lacked the story. They had the quality, but they lacked the connection. They were the perfect vehicle. It was exhausting juggling this double life, but every time I felt tired, I'd hear that word plain and I'd find more energy. I didn't go to them with a sob story, I went to them with a business proposal. I requested a meeting not as your wife, but as a private consultant. I sat in that stark modern conference room, and I laid it all out. I presented a SWOT analysis of your company, David. I pinpointed the exact vulnerabilities, your over-reliance on legacy brands, your sluggish supply, chain, your marketing, that spoke to a demographic that was aging out of your target market. I showed them where you were soft, then I presented my solution. I wasn't just selling insider information that would have been a short-term play. I was selling a narrative. I explained that your greatest weakness wasn't your product, but your perception. You were seen as stale, traditional, out of touch. And I, the woman you had presented as the perfect corporate wife, was the key to unlocking a new image. The negotiation was the most exhilarating experience of my life. This wasn't about asking for an allowance. This was about defining my worth. The brand ambassador title was the public face of it, the part that would get the headlines. But the real agreement was in the closed-door strategic advisory role, a seat on the marketing oversight committee, a direct line to Alara. I had equity, real meaningful equity. I built an airtight case for why I was the right person. I knew the customer you were failing to capture because I was that customer. I was a woman of a certain age with disposable income who was tired of being spoken down to by brands like yours. I could bring authenticity because I had lived the alternative. I wasn't an actress reading a script. I was the script. Alara saw it immediately. She saw the business intelligence. But more importantly, she saw the power of the story. We weren't just launching a campaign, we were launching a statement. The launch was a masterstroke in corporate warfare disguised as a marketing campaign. We didn't ignore your brand, we used it as a foil. Your tagline was always about tradition, about legacy. Ours was about reinvention, about the courage to change. The campaign was built around my face, my voice. The photography was sharp, intelligent, confident. There were no soft filters. It was me looking directly into the camera, talking about value, about quality, about making conscious choices, rather than defaulting to the familiar. We ran it everywhere, the same magazines, your ads were in the same digital spaces. We were having a public conversation, and you weren't invited to speak. The authenticity was the weapon you never anticipated. Consumers are smart, they can smell a marketing ploy from a mile away, but they can also recognize truth. The buzz started subtly at first, industry blogs, picking up on the interesting move by Ethelgard. Then the business sections of the major papers ran pieces on the corporate coup. They connected the dots, they figured out who I was. And instead of it being a scandal, it became a story of empowerment. It was a better story than anything we could have fabricated. The campaign wasn't just visually compelling, it was narratively compelling. People weren't just buying the product, they were buying into the idea. They were voting for the underdog, for the person who had taken her destiny into her own hands. The results were quantifiable. That's the beautiful part. This wasn't about feelings, it was about numbers. Within 2 quarters our market share began to erode, yours not in a massive landslide, but in a steady worrying drip. Your key demographic stagnation became a decline. Ours saw double-digit growth. Industry awards started coming our way. The campaign was a case study in effective rebranding. You'd see the reports, the charts that showed your company's trajectory dipping, while ours climbed. Those charts were my victory laps. Every percentage point was a validation. You were no longer just my husband who had underestimated me. You were the CEO of a company that was losing ground to a strategy I had conceived and executed. It was on one of these forums that I caught the attention of a headhunter. She sent me a private message, complimenting my insights. We moved to a call. Her voice was brisk, professional. She said my perspective was refreshingly authentic. She asked if I'd ever consider a role that leveraged that authenticity. I was cautious, of course. I didn't mention my husband. I went through the interview process with a rising sense of destiny. It was for Omnia Ventures, his most bitter rival. The final interview was with the victory wasn't in any apology you might have eventually offered. That would have been a hollow personal thing. The victory was in the quarterly earnings call I listened to, where you were forced to acknowledge unexpected competitive pressure in the market. The victory was in the respect I saw in Alara's eyes when we reviewed the latest sales figures. It was in the offer I received to join the board of a major retail association. You were finally forced to see me not as your wife who had rebelled, but as a formidable professional whose strategic move had genuinely hurt your bottom line. That shift from personal spouse to professional rival was a more profound and honest reckoning than any marital counseling session could ever have provided. The lesson here for business and for life is simple and timeless. It's a lesson in due diligence. You failed to properly assess your most valuable asset. You mistook proximity for understanding and silence for compliance. You never considered that the person who shared your home, who listened to your every worry and ambition, was also conducting a 20-year-long competitive analysis. You broke the most basic rule of strategy. You underestimated your opposition. And the quiet ones, the ones who listen more. Then they speak, the ones who observe from the sidelines. We are always the most strategic. We have nothing to do but plan. And when we finally make our move, it's not an emotional reaction, it's a calculated decision. It's the culmination of a long-term strategy, and it's one you never see coming. The plain comment didn't just land and then fade away. It stuck, it burrowed deep like a splinter under a fingernail that you can't get out. And my first instinct, my only instinct, was to turn to my husband. I thought, he's my person, hell, understand, hell, see how much that hurt. So I tried to bring it up later that evening. We were in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound. I remember leaning against the counter holding my mug of tea, just for something to do with my hands. I said something like, you know what you said earlier about me being plain. It kind of stung. A little. I tried to make my voice light to laugh it off, but it came out thin and shaky. He barely looked up from his phone. He just waved a hand, a dismissive little flick of the wrist. Oh, come on, honey, don't be so sensitive. You know, I didn't mean it like that. It was just an observation. You're just you, reliable, steady. That's a good thing. And that was it. That was the entire conversation. He made me feel like I was making a mountain out of a molehill, like my feelings were an inconvenience, a minor drama he didn't have time for. And the isolation that created was so much worse than the original comment, because now I was alone with it. I started to believe him, that I was just being overly sensitive, that this deep aching sadness was my own fault for misinterpreting a simple factual statement. So I withdrew. I stopped texting my friends back. As quickly I made excuses to skip our weekly coffee meetups. I'd say I was tired, or that work was busy. The truth was I was ashamed. I felt like a burden. If my own husband, the person who was supposed to know me best, saw me as this unremarkable plain woman, then what must my friends think? I assumed they were just tolerating me out of pity. I convinced myself I was the boring one in the group, the one they wouldn't even notice was gone. The loneliness was a physical weight. I carried it in my shoulders, in the constant tightness in my chest. I felt like I was fading away, becoming translucent, just like he said I was.